And it's recording. Yeah. Started recording.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to this discussion. Thank you for taking the time on a Saturday afternoon to come and listen to talk on abortion. So you've probably seen the title of the talk. It's Abortion, Conscientious, Objection, and the Law. And we are very privileged to have Adv Keith Matthee with us today. And I'm just going to ask Dr. Seybrandt. Dr. Seybrandt is the daddy, and his wife Celeste is the mommy of the CMF, Tygerberg campus. And so I'll just ask him to introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Do you want to open for us?
Oh, yes, I would. Thanks. Let's close our eyes. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for such a lovely day. Thank you for the rain. Thank you, Father God, that every good and perfect gift comes from above. Thank you that you bless us, Father God. You shower us with blessing, undeserved, unmerited favor, God. God, as we discuss this topic, I pray that you would anoint the speaker. I pray that you would encourage our faith, God, and spur us on to love and to good works, God. I pray that everything that happens here today might be for the encouragement of the saints, and I pray that it would be to glorify your name. In your name I pray. Amen.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a privilege to be here. My name is Seybrandt. I met just a few of you. It's nice to see new faces. Are you all from Tygerberg? Anybody not from Tygerberg campus? Maybe it's me. Okay, cool. So it's my privilege to introduce Adv Keith Matthee to you. I met him via the grapevine and with the Wilberforce Academy. And I'm going to read his bio to you. There's a lot. His credentials I don't want to miss. So Adv Keith Matthee was admitted as an advocate in 1979. He left law in 1979 for 8 years to work as a missionary amongst university students. In 1987, he obtained a Bachelor of Divinity degree, majoring in New Testament studies and Hellenistic Greek. Okay. He returned to the bar in Grahamstown as an advocate in 1987. In 2002, he was appointed as senior counsel by President Mbeki. He has appeared in all the courts of South Africa, including the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal. So we are very honored to have you, Adv Keith. Since 1991, he has served in an adjudicating role in different forums, including serving as an arbitrator, a presiding officer in the Industrial Court, an assessor in the Labour Appeal Court, and on a number of occasions as an acting judge in the High Courts of Port Elizabeth or Tygerberg, Grahamstown, East London, Tata, Cape Town, and Gauteng, so everywhere. He's authored many books, including The Resurrection, A Lawyer's View, The Emperor Has No Clothing, Decolonizing Jesus, Whose Way, and with his wife, One Man, One Woman. That's very recently published, right? Normative value system. He married Rosalind Dorrington in 1980.
Who are you dealing with? What, you're all medical students, or you're some occupational therapists, some physiotherapists, some nursing, but who am I dealing with? Here too?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other non-doctors, nursing, any occupational therapists, physiotherapists? So everyone else, and what sort of years are we talking about? What, first year, second year, third year, fourth year? Yeah, 6 years, eh? All second. And you had front? Or first and fourth. Okay. Okay. Is that why you've got a second? We'll just keep the class distinction. And there? Okay, so you're nearly there. You're nearly, and at the back? Second and fifth. And you're allowed to sit next to it, or she's allowed to sit next to you. I don't want to waste it. First, what time have I got? What time have we got?
3 hours a week. No, I'm sorry. What are you keen for? I mean,
If we add to finish there, 2:03, is that okay? A lot depends on you. In fact, I can talk non-stop for 3 hours. No problem. Okay? I want to know where you reach it. Okay, so that's 3. We don't have to use all that time. Let's have that.
I'm just joking about the 3 hours.
No, that's we stop at. We add to not like to the 3. Everyone okay with that? Sure? Okay. Now, what the little one you've just seen, you're all in the either nursing or doctor profession. So I would have thought that most of you would know that at 9 weeks, what you see is what we have at 9 weeks. Was that the first time for some of you to see a visual representation of a 9-week-old unborn child? The doctor friend who gave it to me said that was probably the arm, the hand, the little one's hand, that is to protect it against the light from the camera. That's probably why. Does anyone know how many of those little ones, from when you woke up this morning to when you go to bed at night, tonight, will have been intentionally killed in South Africa? Anyone have any idea?
10,000 per day.
How many?
10,000 per day.
Not quite 10,000. But in the region of 450 to 500. Now, in terms of the Abortion Act, or what's called the Termination of Pregnancy Act, 1996, the health department, headed by the minister, is supposed to keep stats. And when I took the matter to the courts, one of the things I had to do in the papers was to try and find out what the stats were to present it to the court. And there's no ways the department had the stats. So I had to find other sources. And you'll find that in footnote 3, there's copies of this book, enough for all of you, and you can take additional ones. Please, I like to distribute them as much as possible, no cost. This isn't easy reading. The emperor has no clothing. Any guess who the emperor is? But quite close to that, it's more specific. It's the 11 justices of the Constitutional Court. And my attorney, who briefed me in the matter, I gave him copies of this book, and I asked him to hand deliver it to each of the 11 judges in constitutional hearing. And it's an angry book. And I accuse them of being dishonest, being callous, being indifferent to human life. But you can read this will bring you up to speed about what's happening in the legal field about unborn children in terms of trying to use the courts in South Africa to protect unborn children. The only further attempt to help unborn children was a case that was brought by various folk, including Ryan, on the course of justice. Do any of you know the Birth and Deaths Act? Now, in terms of that, trying to go to memory, the unborn child, the parent has no right to the unborn child up to 27 weeks, I think it is.
26 weeks.
Is it 26?
Yes.
Up to 26 weeks. And they went to court to try and get the court, including eventually the Constitutional Court, to give parents the right, if their little one dies at 20 weeks or whatever, to receive the little one so that they can bury them.
It was seen as medical waste.
And they could not be regarded as medical waste. And the Constitutional Court refused to cover. Okay, so that's sort of the only one later than this. You can see why I say the emperor is stark naked, and the emperor are the 11 justices of the Constitutional Court. I see this house is called Ubuntu House. What does Ubuntu mean?
I am because you are.
I am because you are. What does it actually mean, by the way? I am because you are. Was Hitler, I am Hitler, and therefore you are Goering? Any other days? What is a good? Sorry?
Community.
Community? Okay. Because then you need to ask the question, what's community? When our, and this is dealt with at length in this book, the Emperor Has No Clothing. In the negotiations leading up to the independence in 1994, there were two issues, moral issues, that the parties simply couldn't reach agreement on. And it was agreed that, okay, those two issues would be dealt with after the Constitution was put in place and after the new government was elected and we had our new democratic parliament. Any idea what those two issues were? Abortion is one, and the death penalty. Those were the two issues. The death penalty came before the Constitutional Court in a matter, remember correctly, about 1996. And all 11 justices and the people concerned were both had brutally murdered more than one person for gain. And they'd been sentenced to life because to death, because it was still just before 1994, where if there were no extenuating circumstances, the judges then had to sentence the person to death. So that's how it came before the Constitutional Court. And all 11 justices wrote a judgment, and they agreed with the outcome. But it's very seldom that in a judgment, usually one judge or two judges write a judgment and the other simply say, we agree. Yeah, all 11 judges wrote a judgment. And if I remember correctly, 7 of them relied very heavily on Ubuntu to justify their conclusion. And their conclusion was, all 11 judges, that the right to life, there were other reasons as well, but central to it was that the right to life in the Bill of Rights. You couldn't have the right to life and the death penalty. You couldn't, and in a society where Ubuntu must drive society, you couldn't have the death penalty. So they relied, there were 7 judges who relied very heavily on Ubuntu to reach the decision, no, the death penalty is not should not be allowed in terms of our Bill of Rights. Relying very heavily on the Bill of Rights, which says everyone has the right to life. Eventually, in 2016, in this matter that I write about, it was brought to the Constitutional Court, the other issue. The Constitutional Court, in one sentence, without giving any reasons, wrote off the argument that an unborn child has the right to life and should be given protection. So for convicted murderers, they wrote about 130 pages saying why they should be treated with dignity. It came to unborn children, and that's why I knew the figure, I put that before them, that something in the region of 450 babies were being killed every day in South Africa by means of abortion. I also relied very heavily on Ubuntu, referring to the death penalty matter and how that influenced the judges, and the response of the 11 justices was simply one line: there's no merit, no prospects of success, with absolutely no reason as to why there was no prospects of success. I deal with the great length in this book. So those two issues, death penalty, abortion, when it came to convicted murderers, they went to great lengths to support the dignity and the life of these convicted murderers, but not with abortion. So that, within the law, that's what you're dealing with. Those, I think we've reached a stage where our Constitutional Court justices, firstly, are beyond the pale. That if they can treat unborn children like that, how can we have any confidence in their moral integrity on other issues? But read the book. As I say, it's not an easy read. It's quite an angry book, but it's written by myself as a lawyer, but it's written in a way that's accessible. You'll be able to follow it, you'll understand. Everything I say is backed up. There's footnotes, there's references. There's no wild sort of assertions of me backing up. Because I had to do that because I gave a copy of the book to each judge, and they've done nothing against me. If there was something there that couldn't be backed up, they would have, at the very least, charged me with contempt of court. And they haven't. It's now 8 years later. But let's get to the topic and of conscientious objection, abortion, and in the profession. What is it that we want to do when it comes to abortion? What drives us? Why folklore? Sorry? Okay. I mean, is there, when you see that little one, and I tell you that 450 of those little ones, and since 1998, it adds up to about 2.5 million. 2.5 million. We now actually are getting to a Holocaust, German Holocaust situation, where there 6 million Jews were murdered. We're now at 2.5 going on 3 million. Intentionally being killed. How do you respond as people in the medical profession?
I think it's contrary to everything that we proclaim as medical professions. We care for life, we care for health, and we completely do the opposite of murder in society. Very good.
And who are we wanting to defend? Who's the patient?
The same one, right and wrong.
Sorry?
The right and wrong. Right.
But who are we, why are we here? Who are we wanting to protect as doctors, as nurses? Who's the patient, the mother is the patient, but do you have another patient?
Yes.
What's that got to do with your conscience and your right to conscientious objection? The right to conscientious objection is about yourself. You hear what I'm saying? We live in a narcissistic, self-centered world. You know, when I was asked to I don't know, some of you might have heard of Jacques, of course, the doctor's been given such a hard time trying to convince a young woman who wanted to kill her 19-week-old baby. And he was stopped from practicing for about 3 years. He's not just started his community service now. When I was asked by Doctors for Life whether I'd be prepared to help him, I said, well, let me go and I want to go and talk with him. And I said, what's your story, Jacques? And his story was the title you gave me. My conscience doesn't allow me to do it. I have a right to conscientious objection. In terms of the Bill of Rights, I have a right to conscientious objection. I said, Jacques, I'm not prepared to help you. You go and get a lawyer, because I don't charge. Go get a lawyer, pay the guy big money, and he can protect your conscience. I'll only help you if you come on board with me that we'll be fighting for our unborn children. You see the difference? You see, it's really important to see that difference. I've got, and I won't bore you for hold it when we get to questions. I was asked by a couple of doctors and nurses, George Provincial Hospital, and they've got a whole conveyor belt. The head of the George Hospital at that stage, this was 2018, had a whole conveyor belt system. And it was the anaesthetist who primarily called me in, but then she got various other folk around, and she said, you know, she was being asked to clean up the mess through a DNC, to be part of that process. They would initiate it at the clinics, they'd give the women the pill, and then of course that starts the process, and then they would come to the doctor, come to the hospital, and then they would have to finish the process, the DNC. And she had a problem of conscience about it. And I examined the process and we investigated the process, and I also got hold of the documents. I don't know, Sabron, if you could help me. But at that stage, the relevant Western Cape was Circular 835 of 2016, Chief Directors Metro and Rural District Health Services Health Programs, and it was a circular about abortions. I don't know if there's anything subsequent to this 2016 one. We wanted to have to check. And there they also referred to, they incorporated in that circular the best practice paper number 2, June 2015, by the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And if you looked at those two papers, they were saying quite clearly that the Western Cape will become the most efficient baby killing machine in South Africa. That's the downside of being in a province that works better than other provinces. The downside is it's far more efficient at killing babies than the rest of the other 8 provinces. That's how Satan works. The efficiency, which should be good for health, and we need efficiency. But the downside is the Western Cape is the most efficient province at killing babies. But part of the circular got a whole section here on conscientious objection. The department respects the right of healthcare workers to conscientiously object and participate in termination of pregnancy. I'll get to language, by the way. Language is really important. Don't be seduced by language. Call something by what it is. I'm even uncomfortable with the word fetus, because it's a step away from the contents of a woman's uterus, which is the description of an unborn child in the Abortion Act of South Africa. However, the client's right to information, that's the pregnant woman, and access to healthcare services, including termination of pregnancy, must also be respected. Should a healthcare provider wish to exercise his or her right to conscientiously object, he or she may do so, providing the client is offered all the necessary information that will allow her access to services. In other words, the services to kill the baby. The client must be respectfully referred to a colleague who is willing to assist the client in obtaining the service. Protection of the healthcare worker's spiritual interests should not be at the cost of the patient's health or other interests, nor should a healthcare worker subordinate a patient's religious convictions to his or her own. You see the problem if you're going to base this whole issue on your right to conscientiously object? I'm asking, do you see the problem with the title you gave? If that's your foundation, you're still expected to participate in the killing of unborn children. You just don't personally. And that's why my first question, who are we here for? Is it your conscience or is it the unborn child? You spoke with me? We need to have that mind shift. It's not about our conscience. Of course, we by being good doctors and good nurses, that's in line with our Christian consciences. But it's about protecting unborn children and looking after the traumatized mother. And if you simply base it on your right to conscientiously object, and I'm called in to help you, and you, like Jacques, he didn't refer the mother to another doctor. He told the mother what he or she was doing, and he didn't refer her, and that's why they went after him. And we had 3 sittings of the disciplinary hearing. I asked, and apparently you have been given 2 reports that we submitted to that disciplinary hearing. The one by Chris Morton, for many years was the lecturer of embryology at UCT. And then by Professor Coleman, who looks at many studies of the long-term adverse emotional effects, traumatic effects of an elective abortion on the woman. And what did the Medical Dental Council do when they were confronted with that? Because no longer was our defense conscientious objection. Jacques' plea, and we pleaded, was that as a doctor, turns the Hippocratic oath, do no harm to good. He had 2 patients. Dr. Walter made it quite clear it's very reasonable for a doctor to see that they have 2 patients, especially if you look at and the evidence he gave, and the excellent evidence, you have a heart, you guys know, for 3 weeks the heart starts beating, and so it goes on. And there's never a point where that little one is not a human or becomes a human. That little one is a human from the beginning. And he says that's not even contentious anymore in medical circles. It's only contentious in non-medical people. They try and make the point. But when it's medical folk, they know from conception we're dealing with a human being. The DNA is there, it's set. And what did the Medical Dental Council do after 4 years of going on to Jacques? And we presented that to the disciplinary hearing. They sent us a letter saying they are now they've decided to withdraw the charge. We then went to court, and the matter is still in court, to get an order to force them to reconvene the disciplinary hearing, because we want a not guilty finding. You see, the Medical Dental Council don't want to get them, they know that's what will come. But crucial was Jacques not relying on his right to conscientiously object. In his defense, he said, as a doctor, in terms of the woman, the Professor Coleman evidence is very clear that there's significant sound evidence of long-term, and we're talking about 30, 40, 50 years, emotional adverse effects to women who make a decision for an elective abortion. And he needed to tell that to his patient, the woman. And then, if you look at Chris Wharton's report, we're dealing here with a human being. I mean, why doesn't the doctor, I mean, I remember when we were pregnant, our first kid, I thought my wife was just far, you know, she was extreme. She didn't want to put nose drops in. And she went to the gynecologist. I said, no, you're being stupid. I mean, how can nose drops affect the unborn? And the gynecologist said, yes, it can. It goes straight into the bloodstream. You know, so as doctors, when a pregnant woman comes to you, why don't you give them certain medication? Because it's going to affect the unborn child. So if you look at it rationally, a doctor can be held up for being irresponsible or unprofessional in terms of what they give the woman, in terms of her child, but it's okay to kill the child. You know, in the first case that I argued in Joburg, the judge, believe me, I'm not lying. You can read it. A quote from the judge. One of the points she used to find against it, this is before I went to the Constitutional Court, was that we had not presented evidence to court to show that an abortion would have an impact on the unborn child. That's what she said in black and white. That's what she said. Yeah, your response. I mean, I speak to everyone and I say, that's what she said. And they say, what? Because you see, in court, you generally have to prove things. You can accept certain things, like if you say, Mr. Ramaphosa is the president, you don't, you know, everyone knows that and you wouldn't have to give evidence and the court would take judicial notice of it. And she said, no, we hadn't presented evidence that an abortion would have an adverse effect on an unborn child. That's what you're dealing with. And I think she's going to end up in the Constitutional. But that's how powerful the whole so-called pro-choice lobby is. Incredibly powerful, and it takes courage to stand up to it. The other lie, in the Western, and it's just a circular, but I need to just tell you also one of the things they say in the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists that they rely on. Firstly, this was in 2017. Thanks to a 3-year multi-million pound grant, this is the Royal Gynecologist and Obstetrician Fellowship. An important new initiative called Leading Safe Choices offers the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, RCOG, a unique opportunity to address this unmet need. Leading Safe Choices will initially pilot in Tanzania and South Africa, and focus on postpartum family planning in both countries and on comprehensive abortion care. By that they mean giving abortions. In South Africa, and comprehensive post-abortion care in Tanzania. The program has three broad objectives: developing a comprehensive abortion strategy care in South Africa, training healthcare providers and supporting the delivery of high-quality PPFP and comprehensive abortion care in South Africa, establishing a formal accreditation and certification process. The long-term vision is to expand the initiative across South Africa and Tanzania and to other countries following on from this pilot phase. Okay, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a conspiracist, but I'm reading at the moment a book by Robert Kennedy Jr. And it's turning my world upside down. And central to it is people like Gates, who are obsessed with controlling population. Central to it. And it's just stunning what they've done in Africa. Under the guise of helping Africans. It's criminal. And this ties in with that. The Abortion Act, our Abortion Act, in the preamble, it says it's not a form of contraception. And I argued this in court, that if what's happening is happening, what else is it but a form of contraception? But what I actually wanted to alert to is, in this thing that the Western Cape followed, if informed in line with best practice, abortion is safer than childbirth. And they repeat it on the next page. Abortion is a safe procedure for which major complications and mortality are rare for gestations. If performed in line with best practice, abortion is safer than childbirth. And then they say this. Then they say, and this is in terms of the expert evidence that, and I've sent you that, and that we used before the Medical Clinical Council. This is simply a lie. There are a number of myths about the consequences of abortion. If the woman expresses concern, she can be reassured that there are no proven associations between induced abortions and subsequent ectopic pregnancies, placenta previa, infertility, breast cancer, or psychological problems. So that's what the Western Cape Health Department is sending out to you as future doctors and nurses. It's saying you need to tell women. It's a myth that there are dangers of long-term psychological problems. And that is simply a lie. And how do you take on the lie? You take it on with evidence, with data. You scientists, you take it on with data. And that's where this, just on that point, I did ask Sadie to send it on. Where are we? Okay. This is just a brief overview of the abortion mental health professional literature by Professor Coleman. Over the past several decades, the number of peer-reviewed studies identifying adverse mental health outcomes associated with abortion have increased dramatically, as has the scientific rigor of research on this topic. The literature base, comprised of hundreds of studies, has revealed that women who choose abortion experience increased risk of mental health problems, including substance abuse, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and suicide, among other conditions and symptoms. And then she has about citations of 10 of the studies, and they're all this century. The oldest one is 2002, and goes all the way up to 2016. In a 2013 narrative of literature published between 1995 and 2011, incorporating 30 peer-reviewed journal articles by Italian researchers, Liliani and Bonio-Cole, the authors concluded, quote, the studies analyzed here show that abortion is a risk factor for mental illness when compared to childbirth. So that, then you have data, you have studies that make a nonsense of what the Western Cape Health Department is sending out in their surveys. And she has other she ends off the summary. My review offers the largest quantitative estimate of mental health risks associated with abortion available in the world. After applying methodology-based selection criteria and extraction rules to minimize bias, samples consisted of 32 studies, 36 measures of effect, and 877,297 participants. It's a massive, I mean, you're talking about a huge group. Results revealed that women who aborted compared to women who had not experienced an 81% increased risk of mental health problems. Now, why am I highlighting that just as an example? Is if you rely, and I go back to the mind shift, if you rely on your right to conscientiously object, if you call me in as your lawyer, I can't use it here. Then I have to get involved in, the right to freedom of conscience, the right to believe what I want to believe, the right of opinion, which has got nothing to do with data. You guys are scientists, and the science is on your side. The science is on your side. I can't tell you, I mean, this George folk I went to, I don't know if you've sent the letter out, where I set out a strategy. We could reduce that conveyor belt that they had in George. We could save 50–60% of the babies. But what we needed were doctors and nurses who were brave. And whenever I talk, throughout the country, I always say, and I'm a senior counsel. I've been a senior counsel for 22 years. I know the law. And I offer my services at no cost. And someone said, do I want to come? It's a 4-hour trip here and there. I said, please, anything. Because even if I just inspire one of you, there's a wonderful American young woman. She was just convicted in her high school, when she's still in high school, and she's now about mid-30s. She's unbelievable. I forget her name, and I asked my wife just to send me her name. But there's a wonderful interview with her with a guy called Dave Rubin, who's pro-abortion.
Is it Lila Rose?
Lila Rose. Go, unless YouTube have taken it off.
No, it's still there.
Is she still there? Now, that Lila Rose, she has saved hundreds of thousands of babies. It just takes one of you. And that's why I come. It just takes one of you. So you know what? That's my life calling. And what greater life calling as a doctor or as a nurse? And what I offer is because they're going to go after you. And I'll be there. At no cost. Let me pay for my own victory. But you see, you need the mind shift to move away from my right to conscientious object. Saying, the data, the science is written. In the Abortion Act, the Termination of Pregnancy Act, there's two clauses that. Has anyone ever seen the movie Amazing Grace? That's how William Wilberforce basically got rid of slavery worldwide. Him and his mates in the 18th century. And they came up, they went to Parliament and they were just defeated. And they just went on and on, they could never get anywhere. Then they came up with a cunning plan. And it was an obscure plan, it was thick, and it actually stopped slavery worldwide. And my cunning plan, when it comes to unborn children, is to actually use the Abortion Act itself. But what I need are nurses and doctors. In the Abortion Act, it's called the Choice of Termination of Pregnancy Act 92 of 1996. The first thing, folk, you can do is watch your language you use. Like here, they will refer to the contents of a woman's uterus. Even try and stop using fetus, say unborn child. It's important. Language is important. And basically, in terms of this act, if you look at it carefully, there are really no restrictions on the nurse or the doctor. They can, particularly doctors, they can kill babies and there are no consequences. Because there's no penalties, effectively, against doctors. But there's two provisions. 5.1 of the Abortion Act. Subject to the provisions of Form 5, and Form 5 deal with a woman who's mentally handicapped. It's not able to make a decision herself. The termination of pregnancy may only take place with the informed consent of the pregnant woman. Now, how do you understand informed consent? What is informed consent? I was involved in a matter in 2002, which I lost also about abortion. But there's a quote from that judge, from that judgment that I lost, that I think we can use. And he defines what informed consent is. Dealing with what informed consent means in the Act, the judge in that case wrote, and you have been sent this letter, by the way, this is the draft letter I sent to George Hospital. It must be clearly shown that the risk was known, that it was realized, that it was voluntarily undertaken, knowledge, appreciation, consent. These are the essential elements, but knowledge does not invariably imply appreciation, and both together are not necessarily equivalent to consent. The requirement of knowledge means that the woman who consents to the termination of a pregnancy must have full knowledge of the nature and extent of the harms or risks. And that's what the law is. Must have full knowledge of the nature and extent of the harms or risks. Just as an aside, I wonder how many of the millions upon millions who had the COVID injection were aware of the full nature and extent of the harms and risks. So that's another issue. The requirement of appreciation implies more than mere knowledge. The woman who gives consent to the termination of a pregnancy, quote, must also comprehend and understand the nature and extent of the harm or risk. The last requirement of consent means that the woman must in fact subjectively consent to the harm or risk associated with the termination of a pregnancy. By the way, this applies to any medical procedure. Must extend to the last requirement of consent means that the woman must in fact subjectively consent to the harm or risk associated with the termination of a pregnancy, and a consent must be comprehensive, in that it must extend to the entire transaction, inclusive of its consequences. So here we have a study which says 30, 40 years on, women who've had elective abortions, significantly higher suicide, significantly higher alcoholism, significantly higher depression, significantly. In this context, valid consent can only be given by someone with intellectual and emotional capacity for the required knowledge, appreciation, and consent. And there's another gap for us, where a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old comes to us. So that's how comprehensive that what the Act says, there needs to be informed consent. And what I wrote this letter to the George folk. And I said, to stop that conveyor belt, we need to get this letter to the superintendent, because what they were doing is they just gave the, what's the drug again?
It's a process.
Yeah. They just sort of delivered it to the various clinics, and you would have nursing sisters there. The woman would come, and the nursing would just say, I want an abortion, and the nursing sister would just say, take it. And then when it works its way through, eventually, and say, then go to George Hospital and we'll then do the cleaning up there. How does that even start to meet informed consent? The other provision in the Act says that the state must provide counselling, voluntary counselling, but it must provide counselling. There's the Act. That's the section number 4. Now, if we just use those two, say like in the George situation, and a woman comes and you say, okay, there needs to be informed consent. So at the very least, you could show them what I've just showed you, depending on the age of their child. And there's, I mean, that's available, those resources are available. So if the child is 14 weeks, you can show what her child looks like. Immediately you do that, the maternal instinct will just kick in, and I'm persuaded that at least 50% of women say, you know what, no. You see, what the pro-abortion people do, they use language, so they use, in this other, the circular, Western Cape circular, they talk about the products, about how they do the abortion, and then they refer to the baby as the products, and how it must be sucked out, the products. The Abortion Act talks about the contents of a woman's uterus. The other reference is medical waste. So they use language, and most mothers don't realize it. Most mothers are convinced they're traumatized, that's why they're there. I mean, I don't think most mothers, although Savron gave us, my wife is still sort of stunned by that statistic he gave us about the high rate of abortion in Canada. Yeah, I think it was you, and you know, and there, I mean, contraception is freely available, etc., etc., and those would be more, you know, women who just make choices for their careers. But I would think in a place like South Africa, I think most women who want to have, or don't want to have abortion, come for abortion, is probably on there very reluctant. Because they don't think there are any choices. The other expert witness, somebody that I gave to the medical and dental disciplinary hearing, was by a woman, Deborah Lindley. She's actually the first applicant by her. They had to get 3 women to act as applicants in this case, and she was the first one. But she was very involved in fostering and adopting children. And she said in the Western Cape, there are far more people wanting to adopt than there are babies. Far more. So, if a woman comes along and you have a nurse and a doctor who says, right, they want to save babies. What about my conscience? We want to save babies. Right, we get to the law, and this is where I would then come in and advise. So, right, the law says informed consent. So you tell them they must see the little one that they're wanting to kill. That's in terms of the law, full, they must know what they do. They mustn't be patronized. They must know what they do, because they might find out in 10 years' time what they did. And that's when they're really going to have huge emotional problems. That's number one. Number 2, they need to know the long-term dangers of long-term effects, particularly emotional, psychological effects. And number 3, they need to know that there are options, like adoption by fostering. And this, of course, is where the churches are crucial. And thankfully, there are pockets, in fact, there's one in Somerset West, come alongside women in crisis. They say, come, we'll walk this road with you. Delivery of the child, if you don't want to keep the child, we'll find a good adoptive family. And in that sense, it's also the church's responsibility. But if you do that, and as I say, you've got the data supporting you, what you need is a real conviction that that's what's happening and that you want to help save. And that's what convicted Lila Rose. You know, and if you see this interview with Dave Rubin, I mean, Dave Rubin at the end of the interview, you could see he was being nonplussed by this young man. He started off pro-choice and he ended up really having to rethink his position. But then your basis, at this stage I'm now going to hand over to you, but just to end off with saying, the title you gave me, that's the mind shift you need. It's not about you. It's not about your conscience. It's about the little one, and that's how you serve Christ, is by defending the poor and the helpless, the widows and the orphans. Let me just finish off before I hand over. You know, the motive for abortions overwhelmingly are for socioeconomic reasons. It's to make life more acceptable, more manageable. And that was at the heart of child sacrifice to Baal. That's why they sacrificed their children to Baal. Also that their lives would be easier, would be made more comfortable, etc., etc. This is what the Lord has to say about that. Leviticus 20, verse 1. Any one of the people of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel who gives any of his children to Moloch, that's the god that they sacrifice as a child, shall surely be put to death. But that's our thing. So we not, that's sort of the conscientious objection. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. So this is verse 1. But let's go on to verse 4. And if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to that man when he gives one of his children to Moloch, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his faith. Sinking in what Scripture is saying there? It's not enough if you don't have the abortion yourself, if you don't do the abortion. That's your conscience. What Scripture is saying is if you know, and I've told you now 450 of those little ones are going to be killed today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So we all know. And what Scripture says here, if we know and we do nothing, the Lord will hold us to it. So we've got an easy message for Saturday afternoon. But it's not me, it's Scripture. Right, questions, discussion. Just have to speak up, please.
I want to know on a practical note, where do we stand now? I hear what you're saying, that it's not just about consciously objecting and referring to the woman to somebody else. That's wrong. That's putting your head in the sand like a ostrich. But the next step can be making sure we seriously giving informing the mother of everything that the whole process and everything that she is consenting to. If the mother then still says she wants the abortion,
well, that's your one passion. You have another passion. That's with Chris Wharton's, the embryologist. His evidence is very important. like we did with Jacques. He said he had 2 patients, medically. So he would not do the abortion and he would not refer the woman to another one because then you actually part and parcel of killing the other patient. So that's, so even if the woman says yes, you still, I would say, in terms of as a doctor doing no harm, it's simply not an excuse to say, well, I'll let someone else do the harm.
So we just follow, sorry, I'm going
Just follow it and you just try your best to persuade them. And that you will not do it and you will not refer to it. And there will be consequences. But what I'm saying is not to support you. And don't use the word, here's my religion or my conscience, because then you open yourself. Just as a doctor. And you see what you need to do, that's why we need to just choose. There's lots and lots of data. And that's part of my struggle with many things, is there's lots of data that supports the biblical worldview. But we get caught up with propaganda. I mean, the Western Cape Health Department relies on the Royal Council of Gynecological and Obstetrics. And what do they say? It's a myth that they're long-term emotional effects. And they're just wrong. There's data which shows that they're wrong. And I'm saying, be confident. It's part of how medicine is God's gift. And central to that gift is its data and reason and rationality. As soon as we say our conscience, our religion, what we're saying, in one of his judgments, I don't think he's quite realized what he's saying. Sachs, about when he held that he couldn't use corporal punishment with children. And he said, well, I've got 2 worldviews. I've got the one worldview that's based on reason, that says that you can't use corporal punishment. And the other one, the Christian position, is based on faith. Now, that shows you what you're dealing with there. I mean, one of my books, the first book I wrote was The Evidence for the Resurrection. My faith is based on some reason. Yes, there is a step of faith, but I mean, there's a good few steps you can take before that. So, I'm wanting to empower you to say, look, there's good data out there. I mean, one of the things that Sabre, that's sort of where we met, where Sabre expressed a view, a medical view, about the whole thing of gender dysphoria. But the data's on his side. But, UCT wanted to give him a hard time, and they sort of, because increasingly the data is on their side. And when 23, 24-year-old women want now and say, look, you did this to me at 15, now it's irreversible. There wasn't informed consent. You didn't tell me. So I think as Christians who are in the medical field, we need to be confident data. There is data out there, particularly in this area, there is data. But it doesn't mean they're not going to come after you. And they're not going to try and rubbish you and make you a caricature. But that's part of what Jesus said. You want to follow me, pick up your cross. And my main frustration, I've been fighting this fight for I don't know how long now. But is doctors, I think, by nature are conservative, they don't want to rock the boat, just want to get on and care for people. And like the George, which I thought was a wonderful opportunity. And they eventually came back and said, no, that's it. And I can understand that they were depending if they've got young children or, I mean, it's different. But and that's why I rely quite heavily on just the Spirit convicting, hopefully one person to go. A line of rose. And what I offer is, I offer the back and the legal back, saying you're on solid ground. But taking my lawyer hat off and looking more at the sort of an empathetic role, we need to be mindful of the fact that it's not good enough as Christians to simply say, well, I'm not doing it. If we know about the evil, we need to, and there are different ways of doing it. There's an obligation. We will be held accountable, especially when it comes to widows and orphans. In other words, the vulnerable. And who's more vulnerable? It was someone else who.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about the figure of 450.
Sorry?
450, you said 450 kids or babies are Does that include the legal?
That's in my book. In my book, I sort of, as I said, unfortunately they don't. Yeah, but in footnote 3, I sort of give my reference, and I rely quite heavily. In fact, even one of the things I even rely to an extent on those folk who are really going to have to face God one day, Mary Stokes, for the stats. And if anything, I think that's a conservative stat. So I always come in at be conservative. And I say, the number of unborn children affected by this ruling translates to some 4,250 jumbo jets, each carrying 400 unborn children, crashing during the period 1998 to the present day. That is 212 jumbo jets per year, and more than one every 2 days. Yeah, so that's the, and there are the arguments, the red herrings. For example, they'll say, well, you're stopping, how many women die with illegal abortion. Figures are very small. Or they say, well, what about, incest or rape? I mean, you're talking about really small figures. Plus, line of rows is very challenging in that. Do you punish the child because of the criminal father? She's very challenging. I mean, she challenged me on that in that interview. But so they throw out these sort of extreme circumstances, which amounts for very small numbers. But even there, if we not really need to be clear in our mind, are we dealing with a human being? And once you're dealing with a human being, that just changes everything. You then have a duty as doctors and nurses to do no harm, number one, and do good. To the two human beings. And one must never, I mean, don't get my wife on the real culprit she thinks is the living father. She feels for the traumatized mother who's just been abandoned by the father. So it's not to target, and I think that's why we need to get alongside these women. But we need to be clear, and particularly the church needs to come alongside them. The one theologian I quote, an American guy, says, the failure of the church to help in this area shows that we've stopped having a sound economic, biblical view of things and our responsibility as the church. We're not coming alongside these women. We often more often than not are poor. But it is, the West, as I said, this book has really been an eye-opener, and it is a way of population control as well.
Yes, what is your take on people preparing outside of abortions arrested, and how would you
I think it was wonderful, and I think we must do that. It's all part of it, and hopefully they take him to jail because that highlights the case of the unborn child. It's like that woman in England who was just standing outside silently praying. But there's a multi-pronged strategy, and if some folk are called to do that, and I think and it's good to have adverse consequences because that highlights the unborn child. So it's good if you're arrested. Once again, it's not about you, it's about the unborn child. My wife just smiles because, you know, I've got a martyr personality. And the Lord just doesn't want to martyr me. Because it's about Keith Matthee, you see. It's not about the kingdom. But like this book, it's an angry book. And I had to hand deliver to each judge. You know, and I said, okay. And I wanted, because then I would have gone there and I would have said, okay, I want to cross-examine each one. Because I'm allowed to defend myself on why they didn't give reasons. And I'll tell you why they didn't give reasons, because they couldn't give reasons, but they knew it's a hot potato, so they thought, let's just deal with this once and for all with one sentence. And they're the final court. And that's why it's particularly reprehensible. They knew what they were doing. I know quite a few of those folk, they knew exactly what they were doing. But for me, the real fight is now doctors and nurses. And I think with the medical, I mean, with Jacques' matter, they've withdrawn the case. When did they withdraw it? When they were confronted with the doctor. They know. So that's, and you see that if you find, I've offered through Martis, my attorney, he's involved with Doctors for Life. And I said, you know, I'll do a road trip to any hospital in the country, to the nurses and doctors, just to empower them. Because most nurses and doctors, so far in my exposure, it's not their first choice, unfortunately. They're not their first choice. And then, so I see my role as I'm there to empower, to say to them, look, you can be brave. You know, I'll walk with you, there's data behind you, there's sound legal. That doesn't mean you're not going to have a hard time. But, yeah, so that's your, but if you're a medical doctor, then I would think better is wherever you send is to be aware, make yourself more aware of the law and how to use the law to save lives, and then others can stand outside and pray. I think your particular calling is as a doctor. Any other? Yeah.
So I mean, so there's some students interested in something like a pro-life society. There was talks about debate. What do you think about debates on the topic, let's say, among students? Is it useful? How do you approach that?
See, if you can get a Lila Rose, she's really good. And you see, you need someone who just stays consistent, who doesn't get distracted. Who, you know, in these debates, they will throw out arbitrary, extreme situations, you know, and a lot of folk then get distracted and get caught up in that issue. So if you've got someone like and this probably realistically should be a woman. Although rationally I don't see why. I'm a human being and I'm talking about other human beings, but I think probably fine. That's where someone like Lila Rose is really good. But it's got a place, but one just has to, and you see also you have to be clear, because often these debates on that, the narrative is controlled. And the chairman isn't really independent. He's got an agenda. So you have to be careful of being co-opted. But I think it's a multi-pronged strategy. But then to try and get someone, there was someone, you know her, she was at Stellenbosch. I really felt 2 years ago, I think there's someone who could really be good. She hasn't quite come through yet, but I mean, I'm hoping that, you know, I actually said to you, it could be a Lila Rose. Yeah, so just with those caveats, with those things, it's multi-pronged. Where it is a good thing is to, you know, even in the churches, I've spoken, I mean, one of the great, I think, ploys by Satan is they said, no, it's just one of the many social economic problems. And they see it like, you know, you haven't got housing, you haven't got water, you haven't got this, you know, a few babies are killed. And that's in churches. And they don't see how this is an issue. This is an issue of life. That the giver of life, the author of life, we are taking away that way. That's very different from what we have in water. You know, it's qualitatively, it's a different issue. But most churches just seem to see it as one of the many social issues we face. It's not simply a social issue. Personally, I'm absolutely persuaded it's the single biggest moral issue facing the churches today. And as a nation, as long as we allow this slaughter to continue, I said, you know, when back in his million person prayer meeting, I actually said to them, a message, I said, we don't repent of this, God's not going to listen to those prayers. Scripture is clear. God will not listen to prayers where there isn't something clearly to be repented of. And as a nation, we need to repent of this. You know, you're talking about since 1998, 2.5 million days. Conservative. But yeah, debates, someone like an Edith, I think would be great. She needs to be convicted. And then just you'd have to just be careful. You need to really get a good chair who really is independent. And it'd be interesting in medical school because, you know, if I understand what Chris Wharton, I mean, they use his textbooks at UCT. So he's obviously, what does he say? He's got one line here. Yeah. It says the information related to embryonic and fetal development relevant to this case has been well established, very well established for many years, and it's not a matter of the latest research. It's so established that there's no research is necessary. And that's within, you know, and he's at UCT, which is a Christian university, and he was their lecturer, and they use his textbooks. So, as I say, the data is on our side. But we love him with those who come nothing.
There's some students here.
Well, there might be some students here.
So we've challenged we have a pro-abortion society on our campus, and then we challenge them to debate that they refuse they don't know.
You see, in abortion, a thing like that, a code like that, I would, if I were part of the debate, my opening thing would be that 44-second, and they say, well, what it would see. You know, to actually, I mean, it saddens me, deeply saddens me that people can go out and with great passion, and it becomes more consuming, that their life is all about a lion woman. And it's just, you know, I can't start to understand that thinking. But it's good if there is both, you know, it's, and I mean, if one starts getting realistic, you know, one needs to be strategic. You know, sometimes we try and be too strategic, and the English word comes up with something totally different. But you must probably find a black woman would be the right person in such a debate. Particularly if you think, you know, of those babies, which are probably 90% of black kids. I'm surprised at the name has an election. You know? Because it has a significant impact as well. Significant on a particular black community. Just numbers one.
It's interesting, I think, as a comment, a little bit on the side, but I mean, you can think of the rise of fertility as well.
in the world and in the globe. And what I find fascinating is the extremes that people will go through to actually incorporate it. And I'm thinking of in vitro fertilization, because it's about this video of whatever, 7 weeks, 8 weeks. But we think beyond that, how much stress people go through half an egg, get a sperm to actually get there, to consider. And we basically that we get as biological material consistent with, you know, human life and DNA, and they go through all of these extremes and trying to actually modify it. I mean, some of the research coming out, how they're trying to, obviously it's still very controversial and ethical, I'm not going to go into that now, but I mean, how extremely, you know, people with genetic, you know, capabilities and trying to be able to genetically kind of modify so that they can have it, you know. I mean, you have this extreme, people regard simply as a human being within this research and trying to incorporate it and not actually much more of this stuff. I mean, at the same time, you know, it almost doesn't make sense. Like, there's this whole dichotomy that we're sitting with in our modern day and age. We've got such a huge fraction.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, every level is irrational.
If you think of the amount of money that's spent on these technologies and fertility, where, I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, there is a place for well, I mean, there's that, we should have a place as well, but like I said, there's such a large amount of people who want to protect it, and, you know, just that mismatch. Yeah,
I mean, and there are a lot of lies out there. I mean, the other big lie, and it's fascinating, you know, I've come from a generation where we were always told the biggest problem that people face is overpopulation. It's just not true. I mean, the West has got a real problem. You know, just economically because of its depopulation. You know, it's a real economic problem. It's just not a problem. Overpopulation. Neither is it in Africa. You know, we always raise to say, oh, it's a problem. It's not. It's a matter of how we use our resources. You know, if we use our resources, it's just simply not a. And it's part of the. And it's interesting too. This Kenny book I'm reading, that it really is an obsession with the Gates Foundation. It's this population control. And of course, when they think of that, they think of Africa. They think of Africa. You know, and then they come here and everyone thinks they're great and they're giving these vaccines, etc. And you know, that's another issue. But it's part of the narrative. You know, it's God provides life. We're told to go forth and multiply. Obviously, we do concepts of, you know, that's what I talked about, one man and one woman. We give it stable marriage. And God will provide. You know, this climate crisis thing, that God will provide. We just have to apply, and we know we have to be faithful to our spouses, and we faithful to our kids. And if an unexpected child comes along, and it was a blessing. But you see, it goes back to Genesis 3. And what's the temptation of Satan to Eve? You'll be like God. If God really said, you'll be like God. And centered to that, you decide what's right and what's wrong. About verse 5 of Genesis 3. And we're still I mean, now it's just extreme now. We can now decide, now we can even decide, you know, what sex we are, according to the way of thinking. But, yeah, but it's a heavy burden. I've been with it for about 25 years now. And it's great to have young people. In fact, if you come on Saturday afternoon, how cool is it to come and listen to about this issue? You know, tell you about bold sacrifice and you're going to be held accountable. But it's great that you're here. Wonderful. I'll go back. Please, if you wary. And I just would love to 10 years down maybe you come up to you and you become another Lila Rose. Remember that talk? I'm probably wondering that it would be lovely to hear that. And I really am at the end, Sabra. I've been helping in any way. I know that these practices are just starting out. Although some are closer than others. And they're not really in a position of power, but you can engage. And use, and that's why I said, you know, with the base and that, you know, Chris Walton's report about human life, Priscilla Coleman about the long-term adverse effects. In that letter that I asked Sabin to send me for the George Hospital thing, I sent out the quote from the judge as to what informed consent is. You can use, you know, that all those things you can actually use in conscientizing your fellow students. But the big thing is the autism recycling.
I think it's knowing the arguments, because I remember at Mexico there was obviously a big push with obviously agendas and, you know, knowing within the law to be so afraid. I think just knowing some facts and saying that, what about, sometimes you just need to say, but what about this research that shows it?
Well, the fact that,
some arguments, which is
have any of you heard of the Jacques Divorce case?
yes.
I mean, you know, and the fact that the Medical and Dental Council now, 4 or 5 years later, have withdrawn the charges. And that's after a really harassing call. And central to that was we sent them what we were going to give to the disciplinary hearing. And they don't want that to come. That's why they don't want the hearing to continue. They don't want that to come out. You know? That's why I asked Stefan to send it to you guys, and you guys can send it to whoever you want. You know, they're sound professionals, those guys.
So as well, so might be a sort of posters, just contact the CMF, people, not really added to the group as well, or otherwise it's something that you can share. And I think the thing about the information, you know, that you're not alone.
Not
You're
alone.
not alone, like, because you feel like that's someone to lost.
And I think that's important. I mean, doctors for like many years have done it, but they actually listen. I think they need new energy, or they need a new body, you know. America is really well organized. You know, the pro-life American background is really well organized. And I mean, just, you know, one of the baddest days of my life was when Roe versus Wade was reversed. Because I realized in practice, although it had nothing to do with abortion, by the way, it just gave that right to the states to decide. But I knew at least half the states in America would make abortion far more difficult. So you would still have killing machines like California and New York and that, but you know, mostly in the South. And immediately, just that decision was probably in its first year would have saved 500,000 lives or something. You know, that's the practice. And for no other reason, and I really don't like it, he's bunch of that, but for no other reason, I'm just amazed that God used it. I said, you know, if it wasn't for Trump, we wouldn't have got that decision. It's amazing if God uses. I mean, he's the last person I think God would use. You know, but he appointed those judges, and it's those judges who gave us the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And millions of kids have been killed because of that Roe versus Wade decision. But just one decision like that. And you see, that's also why our Constitutional Court judges, they didn't want to go into, because they knew they couldn't counter our arguments, including Ubuntu. I mean, I quoted from the death penalty, and all their Pius Lange, who was the judge, he actually said the Constitution, because the interim Constitution refers to Ubuntu. The final Constitution doesn't, by the way. But he said, we need to look at Ubuntu, we need to look at, it's called a hermeneutical lens. In other words, you know, when I drive around the country and my wife always has nice sunglasses, and she tells me about the sunset. I can't see it. And she gives me her glasses, sunglasses, and then I can see what she's seeing. So what the Constitutional Court judges said in the death penalty is that Ubuntu is the lens that we must use to look at how we interpret and apply the Constitution. And Pius Lange said it's not defined in the Constitution, so and then they each tried to define it. So they had the same difficulty as you of trying to define it. But I use those definitions because surely if it applies to a killer, a murderer, a convicted murderer, it must apply to unborn children. And they knew that. And that's why they didn't give reasons to the Constitution, because they couldn't say no, it doesn't apply. So the data is important, and it's on your side.
Just another question. What about going the route, for example, miscarriage? I mean, I'm just thinking about where at the moment we know of the Birth and Sex Registration Act, it's not regarded as, you know, a human being or like viable. It's used like they use the act. But going back to, for example, a case, I don't know if you're involved about, where they want the, you know, the baby to be buried, but it wasn't regarded as, in fact, they weren't allowed to get back. What about going back to me as Christians and saying, look, miscarriages are not wrong. You know, to kind of get buried, because I couldn't get buried ordered, not get buried ordered, because it's not regarded as.
Yeah, the Constitutional Court is basically left it to the respective hospitals. But they refuse to give parents a right to go bury their little one. I mean, it's just, I've got on my website, it's more books, www.keithmatthee.com, and I was asked by Ryan, of course, for justice, to write a response to that judgment by the judge, and it's just a terrible judgment. It shows no empathy, no feeling for parents who lost a 22, 23-year-old and a week-old child. It's just callous. So you can read it there if you want to. But what you will find, and of course some hospitals, it's up to them. You know, some hospitals would give the remains. But other hospitals use the remains for experimentation. And the others get burnt. Like what happened to Molech. That's how they sacrificed the babies. They had counsel, however, they put the live babies on the fire. The more they scream, the more the gods would be satisfied. The passage I read to you, that was what. And of course, this is what they do with the remains in the hospitals, is they burn them. In that sense, it's similar to the Molech as well. Sorry about the details, guys, but that's actually what happened. And you will know, you doctors and nurses. Okay, I've written 3 other books, and in my right now I just brought out this One Man, One Word. It's a selfie, it's the only selfie we took of one another. The chapter in the Drakensberg, we were married 23 years ago. And in this one, Decolonizing Jesus, it was based on I was asked to give a talk to the UCT students just lunchtime. I asked a friend doing a master's in philosophy. I said, I don't want to speak to a bunch of Christians. How do I get non-Christians there? Give the topic Decolonizing Jesus. It was sort of about 4 years ago, and I tell you, just half the people there had read their resumes. It was like a great talk. So that's where then I decided to use the talk to develop Colonizing Jesus. Whose way? This is just that's me on my horse. There's a chapter on that. I did a trip with my pastor friend from Grahamstown to Carlsbad. It took us about 3 weeks. We slept in the veld. That's chapter 10 is on that. But I deal with other issues there, the issue of violence. I look at Martin Luther King as opposed to Mandela's position on violence from a Christian point of view. And then this is what my wife and I say. If you're interested in these, I have got copies in the car. You don't charge me. Just let me know. You can preach it. But I'd like you to take at least 2 each. I think there should be enough of this. one for yourself and then distribute, because this is about trying to earn more. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Father, we just come and we keep for you. Thank you for gracing him to come and visit us today and come to really challenge us in truth, Lord. Thank you that you give back to him the time and the energy that he spent to come to us. Bless him and his wife and his family. Pray this in Jesus' name.
I say we've got 6 grandchildren because I have 6, 1, 2, 3. Okay, is anyone interested?